Joining me is John Sitilides. He's a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors. Thanks very much for your time. Now, it seems the economic sanctions strategy is not entirely working here. As long as we have this huge need for energy, Putin will get more cash to fund this conflict. What can the leaders at the G7 do to resolve this?
I'm not sure there is any clear resolution, and that's the challenge facing the G7 leaders, both as the leaders of a very important group of advanced industrial nations and also as the respective leaders of their individual countries, each of which has constituencies which are facing similar economic problems that have been exacerbated by the sanctions regime against Russia. So you have falling growth, rising inflation, energy and food shortages, and disrupted supply chains. And so they have to be accountable to their democratic constituencies in their respective countries and try to put together some type of a plan. But as your correspondent just noted with the gold ban by the G7 against Russia, that will only be effective if Russia cannot find buyers outside of the G7 for that gold. But the extent to which countries such as China, India, and other leading exporters are willing to accept gold in exchange for their exports, I'm not sure there's going to be much of a dent from the gold ban.
And what about this idea of a cap on Russian oil? I mean, this comes at a time when leaders are desperately trying to slow rampant inflation. Do you think this is an impossible contradiction or contrast here?
That remains to be seen. The various leaders of the G7 have their own disputes, their own disagreements about whether or not this is most efficacious. We've seen here in Washington that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen floated the idea several days ago, but it still needs to be worked out between Republicans and Democrats here in Washington as well. I think this one is going to be maybe one of the thorniest issues to try to resolve, and it may be weeks, if not months, before we see a final outcome on that.
And I suppose, as you say, just like with the imports of the Russian gold, key buyers of Russian crude are China and India. So how will Western leaders try and coax those countries into a price cap when they've been determined to remain fairly neutral on the conflict?
I don't believe that it's doable, for that matter. Look, every leader of every country is responsible ultimately to his or her own citizens. And we have countries such as China and India, which are major economic powers, but also many countries in the developing world in what we call the global south that have essentially sat out the Western sanctions against Russia because they need Russia's oil, they need Russia's gas, they need Russia's timber, they need Russia's metals and foodstuffs and fertilizers, and they see the Ukraine war as largely a war between Russia and Europe and the United States. And so they have sat on the sidelines, and they're most concerned about preventing food shortages this coming winter, preventing energy shortages, where we might see the type of social unrest, if not political disruption, that we saw in the Arab world 10 years ago.
Now, exports obviously don't just matter to Ukraine. G7 leaders want to support Ukraine, support its economy, but exports of Ukraine matter just as much to the developing world, specifically Africa, where drought and wheat prices are crippling the continent. How can world leaders support the safe route of grain exports out of Ukraine, especially given that they've only got that one port city of Odessa to do it from now?
Well, I'm not sure what world leaders can do. Most of them don't have the military or diplomatic muscle to be persuasive regarding Moscow at all. There may be countries such as China and India that have maintained relations with Russia despite the global Western sanctions, that are able to possibly persuade Putin to allow for some type of a corridor out of Odessa through the Black Sea, the Aegean Sea, and then onto world markets. But the question there is, A, is Putin interested in any type of relief for the Ukrainian economy? And B, what would he ask for in return, especially in terms of sanctions relief? He may also feel that time right now is on his side, and this is a contest of wills between Russia and the European Union, along with the United States, and that his economy is more resilient, his people can ride out the sanctions longer than Western societies can ride out or deal with what are, again, rising gas prices, food shortages, and potentially recessions the end of this year into next year. So there's also the possibility that NATO countries or a NATO-like coalition can put together a militarily defended corridor, but that would risk, of course, the escalation of direct conflict with Russia in the Black Sea and potential Russian strikes against NATO countries.
It's not surprising that the conflict in Ukraine is dominating discussions at the G7 and all the issues that are surrounding it. But what do you think are the biggest topics of the world right now that need to be discussed more by these world leaders? Climate change is an equally pressing issue that many would say need to be discussed. What isn't on the table at the moment?
Well, your correspondent correctly noted this $600 billion infrastructure and investment plan, again, as a countermeasure to China's somewhat successful Belt Road Initiative of the last 10 years, although I don't know how they're going to be able to come up with the $600 billion, both $200 billion from the U.S. and $400 billion from the other countries. It's a plan, but it's a public-private series of pledges, and we'll have more details on Tuesday. I think that's going to be one major issue. The other one is, of course, the German Chancellor's climate pledge. And I think this is going to face the same type of headwinds that almost every other pledge or series of pledges since the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, almost all of which have been unmet by Western leaders. There have been wonderful pronouncements and declarations and statements, but almost every measure of progress regarding climate has been a matter of innovation and technology by individual countries, including the United States, which actually has drastically reduced its carbon emissions because they've transitioned to natural gas. So I think the fact that Germany now, because it's shut down all of its nuclear power plants, is actually firing up coal because they can't wean their dependence off of Russian oil and gas quickly enough, is now going to call for an agenda that imposes punishment on developing countries that want to advance their economic growth using hydrocarbons, because that's how you do this at a fast pace. And then when you're wealthy, you can transition to renewables. It just seems to be quite a disordered sensibility among the G7 leaders regarding issues such as climate. They're just not realistic.
John, really appreciate your insight today. John Sitilides for us, geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors.